Everybody, we're going to get started now on our ground up for construction for childcare buildings. Thank you all for being loyal followers of the SSGA webinar series, and hopefully we'll provide some interesting content for you. I know that many of you have developed your own childcare buildings, so the discussion may be a repeat of what you already know or what you've already experienced. Hopefully we can provide some new content or some new ideas. And for those of you who are just contemplating doing a ground up construction, we recognize that there is a large gradient of knowledge and issues from the rudimentary to the advanced. Our aim today is to introduce to you a lot of the high-level concepts with some data points and particular issues or provisions to think about as you move forward. On a case-by-case basis, you may want to consult with us or your local professionals or with my special guest with questions you have for your particular circumstance. At this time, I would like to introduce our special guest. He is Jon Fahning, Vice President of Real Estate for Shingabee Development. Welcome, Jon.
Thanks, Mike.
Jon and I know each other from working on a couple of child care development deals in the Minneapolis metro area, and his background is particularly relevant to our discussion today. So let's dive in, and hopefully everybody can see my screen. If not, please send us a text message or use the chat bar. So here's what we're going to discuss today. Why are you considering ground up, and what are the pros and cons? What are some of the resources that you will need? How does the schedule work, and what is the process? Obviously, everybody's concerned about how much does it cost. We provide some tips for you that we've learned from other cases that are going to be hopefully universal for you to make sure you don't make the same mistakes that we've seen before. And when it comes to construction, sometimes stuff happens. Now, since this is an educational industry, we use the word stuff instead of the four-letter word, but you all know what I'm talking about. All right, so let's see. Sorry, we missed a slide for Jon. So I'm going to have Jon provide a little bit of background on his company and what his experience is in building childcare facilities. Go ahead, Jon.
All right, thanks, Mike. Again, my name is Jon Fahning. I'm Vice President of Real Estate Development for Shingabee Builders. We're a 35-year-old general contractor based in the Minneapolis area, but also a real estate development group. I've been with Shingabee since 2012. Prior to that, I spent 18 years in the land development side in the Arizona market and working all over the West Coast on projects ranging from a half acre all the way up to 10,000 acres. So I've seen a lot of different development approaches, construction approaches. As far as our experience as it relates to development and construction within the childcare arena, we've done a series of construction projects in the childcare, well over 20, just pure construction, up until about 2012. And then at that point, when I came on board, we started focusing a little bit more on a series of projects, but the childcare was one that really started to pick up, particularly in the Minneapolis area, which then expanded not only our construction experience only, but then we got involved in the development and a series of developments in and around the Twin Cities area focused solely on the childcare side, where we served not only as the land developer, but we were actually the owner on the facility, leasing it to the childcare provider over a long-term period of time. So that provides you a little bit of experience or insight on our experience and what we've done.
Thank you, Jon. Thank you. All right, so let's take a look at the PowerPoint presentation now to go through our topic points. Why would you be considering a ground up construction? First of all, the idea is that your existing building no longer works, and therefore you're not able to operate your business in the manner that you see fit. And we try to tell people that your real estate should not impede your business. Your real estate should be in sync with your business. So if the facility is no longer fitting your needs, then it might be time to explore building a ground up building. Many of our clients look for existing buildings to buy, and they're unable to find something in their budget or in the right neighborhood, or the existing building may be too specialized to convert to childcare. Another reason why you might consider building a new facility is that there's growth happening in a new neighborhood. And the idea that you want to capture that growth before one of your competitors captures it is reason to consider doing a ground up. Another reason why you should consider it is if you have the financial resources. Obviously, the ground up method of expanding your business is going to be more expensive, and there's going to be a challenge when you pay the rent or pay the mortgage during those initial months when you are enrolling the school. So the idea that you would have enough working capital would be another check mark to make sure that you have the financial strength to embark on a ground up. The benefit, of course, is you can build the building the way you want. You can have a bright, new, shiny facility, and that can be a competitive advantage. John, when you're working with some of your clients, what are some of the reasons that they talk about for wanting to go through the time and trouble of building a new facility?
I think there's a series of reasons. One, obviously, a couple of you mentioned the expansion and the growth opportunity. As you look at a lot of these metropolitan areas, development continues to happen, residential continues to happen, retail continues to happen, which then ultimately drives family moves, family growth, those type of things. And so that's what drives a lot of what we've seen as it relates to childcare development. A part of it is too, we looked at and talked with groups where their buildings are just obsolete, and for them to compete heavily in the marketplace with some of the new players coming into the marketplace, they want to have that latest and greatest shiny toy, and something that's going to help them drive revenue.
Exactly. Okay. Now we're going to go to the next slide, and hopefully, there we go. So here's the resources that you are going to need in order to pull off a successful ground up development. They involve the money, and a team of professionals. So the first bullet point is a reminder to those of you who are contemplating a ground up, is even before you start construction, you're going to need money for the due diligence work. You're going to need money for the architecture and engineering. There may be some market research that needs to happen. You may need to employ the resources of an attorney or an accountant. And so it's important to consider the fact that before a shovel goes in the ground, there will be an investment by you to determine whether the ground up is suitable, is feasible. In addition, we recommend to clients that they put together a pro forma budget for the first probably 24 months of the operation of the new school. It's unlikely that you would open a school completely full, and therefore comes the question, if my school is not full at the beginning, do I have enough resources to pay the mortgage or to pay the rent during those initial months? And that's a key question that if you go to a bank and borrow the money, they're going to want to make sure you have enough funds to pay during that startup period. If you have a developer build it for you, there may be a little bit of free rent at the beginning, but the first year will not be completely rent-free. So it's important to have enough working capital or other sources of money to pay the initial occupancy expenses. And that goes not just for rent, but also teachers, utilities, food costs, etc., marketing. And then at the bottom of the slide, we talk about a team. Building a ground-up childcare facility requires the efforts of a team all pulling together. So that means the right architect, the right developer or contractor, the right engineering team. Sometimes you'll need somebody to help you with due diligence and entitlements through the city. Certainly you'll need an attorney and probably an accountant. In many cities, we're finding that public hearings are required, so it's helpful to get a sense of what's happening in the neighborhood and to get to know the folks at the city. So John, in your experience as a developer and a contractor, would you please give the audience a little bit of your perspective on how you evaluate the tenant's ability to pay the rent?
Yeah, it's a series of different things. I mean, we're going to look at, with us as the developer, I mean, our number one thing, and as we go out and get our lending from either our investor group, our banking relationships, or a combination of the both, the first question they have is okay, what's the viability of the tenant? And the viability of the tenant in the childcare world is not only going to look at what's the operator's experience, what is the market that they're providing to, is there a demand in the area, which goes back to some of the initial items that need to be done, the market study being one of them. But we're also going to look at the financial wherewithal of what that tenant has to support that, because again, unfortunately, as a developer, we always look at the worst case scenario. And so those are the things that we just have to understand. And it's not just us, but it's also our banking relationships and our finance groups that are going to look at is what is the wherewithal of that tenant. Just like we would look at any other, be it a retailer, be it a industrial property, whatever that may be.
So as a developer, you are looking at the worst case analysis? I thought developers were eternally optimistic.
That's correct. I mean, again, we look at the worst case, but we always, obviously we develop it best, based on the best case. I mean, we're developing these with the intent that these businesses are going to be successful. And so part of what we do in the process is working with those tenants to make sure that during that site identification and the design, it's a building, it's a location that's going to survive long term. But we also look at it as a developer is okay, 20 years down the road, 25 years down the road, that changes. What else can that property be? And how that building can be converted to something else or, upgraded to another childcare facility, whatever. So, we try to look at it in a holistic approach, not only today, but what's going to happen 10, 15, 20 years down the road.
Excellent, excellent. So the audience should pay heed to that, because one of the reasons why you would even embark on doing a ground up is that your existing facility has become obsolete. So in extending John's comment there, this new building that we're developing in 20 or 25 or 30 years may itself become obsolete. So whether you are the tenant or the owner, the future life of that building needs to be given some consideration as you embark on this process. All right, so let's move on to the flow chart. And there's a lot of arrows and boxes here. What we're trying to show is this is a multi-phase, multi-participant, multi-month process. The old days of going to the city, submitting your drawings, getting a permit, hiring a contractor, building the building, that doesn't work that simply anymore. And so what we're trying to show here is everything starts with the owner in the upper left. And the first step is an output of the requirements of the owner, for the owner to figure out where to build, how big of a building, what should the flow of the classroom be like, what's the playground situation going to be like, how fancy do I want the outside, how much can I afford? And those requirements and criteria then get sifted through a process with the team, with the architect, the engineers, and the various professionals that touch the project. If the owner wants to move forward, then a design phase happens, which is iterative or repetitive. It goes back and forth, and the process is molded, and new inputs come in. An idea to build a wood frame building in a cold weather climate may be modified to build a concrete building. If you're in the South, for example, you may want to, especially with all the hurricanes, you may want to consider how to weatherproof your building and moisture-proof your building. And considerations in California and the East Coast may be different. So the design process is an iterative process that happens between the owner and his budget and the owner and the architect and engineer. And then once the concept and the design is figured out, the architects and engineers then will go into a series of more detailed drawings, which becomes the plans and specs. At that point, it's common for the plans and specs to be delivered to a contractor or several contractors for a process called value engineering. And this is an idea, a consultation process where different trade-offs are made between cost, function, city requirements, and availability of labor and materials. So I'll stop there and I'll ask Jon to give an overview of how he approaches the design process and the value engineering process.
When we talk about that, I mean, there's really kind of two hats. If I'm serving as just purely as the developer, one thing for us is it's really a collaborative process. It's collaboration with the tenant, collaboration with the cities, with the designers, and then with our construction arm as well, because the more we can, vet out all of the challenges we run through as a design, the more we can actually solidify our construction numbers. And so that's really the big thing that we focus on. For us, as if we would just purely function as a general contractor in this, I would encourage everybody, get your general contractor, get your contractor involved as soon as possible in the process. And you may get some that'll say, well, give me a set of plans and then I'll bid on it. Well, that's great, but I think what you do find out is that you sometimes can really vet out a lot of the things and make sure that you're addressing any of your construction challenges early on in the design process rather than after the fact. Because sometimes when they're already designed and you give it to the contractor may bring up some constructability issues. Now you're going back and having to redesign things. So now you're incurring some additional cost potentially with your design fees. And so for us, one of the things that we'll always focus on is really just keeping all of the groups and the communication and the collaborative process really intact. Because again, if you can address a lot of these things up front, your construction and your ultimate occupancy of the building become very clean and very efficient.
So one question for you then, if the client wants to bring in their contractor early, but they don't yet know who they're going to pick, how do you advise the client to interface with a contractor who may not yet have been awarded the job?
I think for the most part is that if you have that open dialogue with the general contractor or the contractor, let them know that you're bringing them on early. Some contractors will offer that as a part, as a free service, because they look at it as, hey, I'm getting in, I get the opportunity to look at this project earlier. I'm going to know more about it. So when it does become the bid process, my bid and my approach to that may be different than my competitors. We've also been brought in early on where owners, operators may bring us and say, hey, you know what? Here's what we need you to do. We'll pay you for that pre-construction services, but there's no obligation for us to hire you at the end. So it really depends on the owner and the owner's approach to the business. But I can tell you, for the most part, general contractors will be open to provide you as much insight as they can, because they look at that as an advantage if it does become within a bidding situation. But the other side of it is, you look at it from a negotiation standpoint. I look at that, if I can come in early and I can help during that process. Again, for us, is we don't self-perform any of the work. Now it becomes a collaborative process where I can get in and work with the owner directly, help them identify who those subcontractors are that are going to be the best fit for that project.
So in that circumstance, the smart contractor will view it as business development and a way to learn more information to provide a more effective bid and increase his chance of being awarded the job.
Very much so.
Okay. So notice in our timeline here that, and of course this is a hypothetical model, but what we're finding around the country is that the amount of time it takes in planning and iterative design can be as much as or more time than the actual construction itself. So under this hypothetical timeline that we're showing you, we're showing 7 or 8 months of pre-construction work, design iterations, value engineering, and there's that box in the middle, the pursuit of entitlements and city approvals. And many communities these days require a public hearing. They require input from various agencies, whether it be water department, fire department. I was involved in a project where the airport had influence, and these things take time. Sometimes you get the NIMBY mentality, not in my backyard, where some neighbors may object, although building a childcare is probably one of the more benign uses you could have. But that pursuit of entitlements and city approvals could be a tortuous and time-sensitive constraint on the project. All right, so let's say you've got through all that and you're ready to, now your project has been approved and now you are going to close on the land. And we'll talk about the money issue in a minute, but now we're actually going to build something, and this requires the contractor to take the lead, take ownership of the process, with the architect and the owner and the money provider looking over the contractor's shoulder. It's important that your contractor and the owner have regular meetings to ensure that nothing gets off track, or if there's a question that comes up, that it's addressed right away. And as the months of the construction go on, there will be a million issues that come up. And to borrow the phrase, stuff will happen. There'll be an omission in the drawing. One of the key subcontractors doesn't show up. There could be a weather issue. So we urge calm and preparation. As the project gets closer to being completed, the integration of what I call the hardware and the software of the project will become even more important. And by hardware, I mean the sticks and bricks, the classrooms, the parking lot. And by software, I mean the functionality of the building as will be approved by licensing, the flow of the classrooms, the signage, the front door entry. And so all those things need to come together to make a successful project. John, would you please talk a little bit about the construction process and the meetings and how to deal with all of the organized chaos that happens on a construction site?
Absolutely. For overall, I think, Mike hit it on the head. The key factor with any role as a general contractor is the communication. Regular communication with the owner, regular understanding of the issues that you're running into, because I think one of the key factors when it comes to developing projects, building projects, is the contractor understanding what is the deliverable and what's what's your audience? In this case, I mean, in childcare, it's your audience is really not only the license or the owner and the children being in there, but it's the licensing agency for that area and understanding those aspects of it. And so I think that really becomes the key factor of working through that process. But again, it's the communication and understanding that and having those groups that are really looking out for everybody's best interest.
Okay, as the project gets close to being finished, then it will be up to the architect and the contractor to deliver the final as-built set of plans, as well as operation manuals on the various components. And as you see at the far right-hand side of the diagram, I put the word vigilance in there because it's the owner's job, or if the owner has decided to use a developer, it's the developer's job and basically the landlord's job to make sure that the building systems are properly installed, that the landlord knows how to run the building systems, especially the air conditioning. With childcare buildings, there's a lot of plumbing involved. If there's a kitchen, there's a number of components in the kitchen and licensing overview of the kitchen. So now that you've spent millions of dollars, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So we like to use the word vigilance and keep that building as fresh and long-lived an asset as possible. John, tell us about the turnover of the keys to the tenant.
So, our process and the way we work is obviously we have the tenant involved during that process, either certain milestones of the building, just depends on what their location is and their proximity to the project. Again, with us having done some of the national groups, sometimes they're there weekly, sometimes they're there monthly, quarterly, really depends, but we try to keep them engaged in the entire process. Then when we get towards the end, obviously the big thing we coordinate with them is the licensing, is making sure everything's addressed. So we're doing some of those preliminary walkthroughs before we get that certificate of occupancy, or at the time we get the certificate of occupancy from the cities. But then we're working with them to address any of those outstanding issues after their pre-licensing walk and their delivery of their FF&E. So, their FF&Es are, fixtures, furnishings, and equipment, where it's, the tables, the chairs, the toys, those type of things that really tie into the licensing and making sure that those are integrated into the facility. So really, because the ultimate goal is to deliver a building that can be licensed, and working with that operator to make sure that we've done everything that we can on our end to help facilitate that licensing procedure.
Right. It's all for naught if we can't get the license.
Correct.
All right, so let's move on from the timeline, and we'll talk about the cost and financial considerations on the next slide. So the key question at the beginning is, who's going to pay? Who's going to own the building? We have clients who want to put their financial resources into the business, and so they would prefer to be the tenant. We have clients who their part of their financial strategy and their business strategy is they specifically want to own the building. And so that consideration needs to happen early on in the process, because that will inform many decisions going forward. So if you are going to be self-funded and you're going to retain ownership of the building, and you don't happen to have $3 million lying around to pay for it out of cash, you're going to need a bank or a lender or an investor to provide construction financing. And then following that is an ability to pay off the construction financing and carry a permanent loan on the building. If you want to put your money into business operations and don't want to have it tied up in bricks and mortar, and by the way, many people ask me, should I own the building or not? And the answer is, it depends. In looking at our client portfolio, it's probably about 50-50. And many of the clients want to own their own buildings. They want to have a tangible asset, even if it ties up some of their capital. And then we have an equally vocal cohort of clients who say that they make more money on the business and they want somebody else to take the real estate risk. I don't think there's a right answer. I think it depends on your personal circumstances and your personal goals. So there's some of you who are self-funded, and then there are some of you who are developer funded. And so in that circumstance, the operator would identify a developer who's going to take the real estate risk and who will reap the real estate reward as well. And those relationships will be documented in the form of a lease between the developer and the tenant. And also the terms of the construction contract will also be documented between the developer and the contractor and the tenant. So that's the overview. If we go to the next slide, then you'll see a little more detail on the two basic types. Under the self-funded mechanism, again, if you don't have $3 million lying around, you're going to need to borrow money for a construction loan. That lender is going to want his money back, and therefore the construction loan will evolve into a permanent loan of some kind. Look at the heading there, matching repayments with operations. So again, the tenant needs to have a method to pay the mortgage payments during those initial months when the school is not yet generating enough money to pay for the rent and the wages and the food and marketing, etc. Many people miss in their budget the time it will take to reach stabilized occupancy. Each market is different. For purposes of abundance of caution, we do not think any school should budget being open with full capacity. That's unrealistic, unless you're closing a school and you're moving all the kids to that new location. That could be an exception. Under the category of legal considerations, our world is filled with more and more paper. There's more and more people touching mortgage financing, so plan on being asked to sign a personal guarantee. If you're going to borrow $3 million and you're not willing to sign a personal guarantee, it's unlikely you're going to get somebody to loan you $3 million if you don't think you're worth the risk. On the developer model, the developer owns the building, the developer gets the loan, the developer issues a lease document to you, and your obligation to the developer is to make timely lease payments. The typical lease profile would be 12 to 15 years of initial lease term, followed by some options to renew. There may be an option to purchase, which I'll circle back to in a minute. The developer also is likely to require you to sign a personal guarantee because the developer's lender has probably asked the developer to sign a personal guarantee. So everybody is banking on the successful operation of the school to pay the rent. John, let's talk a little bit about your considerations when evaluating a tenant and how the lease document becomes such an essential part of the transaction. And let's also, if you would also please comment on the option to purchase and the pros and cons of that provision.
Absolutely. As far as the development and, what happens, obviously, I think Mike explained it, is, the developer, and understand too, is this has been a practice where it's a developer and it's a lease back to the tenant. This is a practice that's common in the retail world, and it's becoming more and more common in the childcare side. So I'll just use an example in the retail world. Look at Walgreens. Walgreens doesn't own their own real estate for the most part. They do own Selective, and it's held under a different entity. The reason they do that is because they want to focus their resources into the business operation and the business expansion. I would say that's the same with Starbucks, Caribou, all of those big groups. Now I think what's being seen is this is becoming a more and more common practice in the childcare side, as we've seen. It's either being developed by REITs, developed by developers like us, where we're owning that. And so we're going to look to the tenant to say, okay, what is the viability of that business? Again, going back to some of that due diligence early on, what's the location like? What's the market study show what the demand is? And then we're going to look into the financials of that, the tenant, their business financials. Again, we don't understand the business per se and the operations day to day, but we just need to know that, hey, they have the financial wherewithal. Because like Mike said, is we're guaranteeing those loans, so we're going to look for that guarantee back from the tenant. So we're going to look at the financials. We're going to look at knowing and getting that comfort level is they've got the ability to support this business long term. Because again, when you're going in with a 10 and 15-year lease, that's a 10 to 15-year partnership that we're going to have with that tenant in a relationship that we have. And so it's kind of the courting side, the dating side, and once we're in the lease, now we're married for 10 to 15 years.
Is there a magic formula or a certain set of ratios that you as a developer look for in order to underwrite a tenant's ability to pay the rent?
I wouldn't say it's a formula. I think what we're going to look for is that, obviously there's some capital in the bank. They've got some assets as it relates to the term. When you look at groups and other developments that we've looked at you're looking at does that tenant have the capital to pay and that cash flow to pay that on a yearly basis for 10 years. So on a personal guarantee, often, you're being asked as that tenant, and we're asking of our tenants is to say you've got to guarantee that for 10 years. So if you do the math and it's $100,000 a year rents and it's over 10 years, that's $1 million guarantee. And so we're going to look towards that to say, okay, does that person have the capital in cash? Is it real estate assets? Is it life insurance to make sure that it's covered if something happens? And so those are some of that evaluation and underwriting that we're going to look at, is to make sure that financial wherewithal is there and being able to support outside of just the business. Because again, you have cycles in businesses. Businesses go up and down depending on the time of the year or certain market conditions. So we're always going to look back as how is that going to be supported if that business slows down.
All right. And the option to purchase, is that something that you like the tenant to ask for, or are you agnostic on the option to purchase? How do you approach that?
I think we're very favorable to the for that option to purchase, because we know that tenant is looking at this as a long-term investment as well. So even if they come in as a tenant with the option to purchase it, we're looking at is they're looking at the long-term viability of this. They're not looking at it as a short-term play. For us as a developer and a lot of other developers, we don't hold on to our real estate long-term. And so ultimately what we do is we develop, get the tenant in place, and then we're selling this typically in an investor market. So there's investor groups out there that just like those performing assets or those real estate that creates an income for them. And if we know going in that, hey, we've got the ability to sell this, we've got a built-in buyer or at least an option to buy it, that provides even more comfort level going into developing a property.
Very good. Okay, let's take a look at the next slide at some actual real-world examples of construction costs in different parts of the country. And this data was compiled from my work with several developers and owners. Some of the specific dollar amounts were modified a little bit due to privacy and confidentiality reasons, but the magnitude of the dollar values and the percentages are good enough here for illustrative purposes. And so what we're looking at here is a project in California that was started, not yet finished, in the summer. We're looking at a project in Minnesota that was planned, but for a variety of reasons did not get off the ground. In Texas, this is a project that's in formation, And in New England, we have a project that's about ready to break ground. And these cost estimates have, if you refer back to our process chart, these are not initial cost estimates. These cost estimates have gone through several layers of iterations, and I would call these cost numbers to be ready to be put into a construction contract. And so in looking at the California property, we've got 65,000 square feet of dirt, which is roughly an acre and a half, at just under $10 a foot for an 11,000 square foot building, license capacity of 180. Notice that even though the land cost is $10 per square foot of land, it's $59 per square foot of building area. And in order to get that piece of land ready for construction, we have to spend another $59 a foot in site work. On this particular project, we had an unlevel site. We had to install utilities to the site, fencing, landscaping, and there was significant asphalt work and driveway work. So when you're contemplating construction, it's not just what's the cost of the land, it's what is the cost to develop the land. The building cost is $168 a foot. In California, wood frame building is common. The building has to have a lot of gingerbread and cosmetic upgrades to meet neighborhood standards. Notice that the contingency account here is roughly $150,000, or about 4%. We generally recommend a higher contingency amount early in the project life, and as more details get known, that contingency can be reduced. One consideration that many of our clients don't have a handle on because they haven't done it too much is a category of expenses called soft costs. And this is the architect and engineer, legal fees, a leasing commission. For example, if you're working with a developer or if there's a finance source being brought in, there's a commission that's going to be paid. And the city fees. City fees vary wildly from neighborhood to neighborhood. California is notorious for having high city fees. And then down at the bottom, this project assumes that they're borrowing money, and that money has a cost. And so the totality of all that results in a $4,172,000 building at $379 per foot. On the Minnesota deal, that's a little bit of a smaller building on a smaller parcel with a smaller license capacity. Notice the price of the land is under $9 a foot. Notice the site work is not nearly as expensive as the California project. And just toggling across to the Texas deal, notice that the Texas deal, the site work is not that expensive either. On the building cost in Minnesota, that building is a CMU, or concrete masonry unit building. That's a significantly lower cost in California. And the other costs fall into line. Let's shift over to Texas. The land cost there was $10 of $10.37. The site work was modest. The building cost, that seems high to me at $1,950,000, $177 a foot. But those are the numbers that we've been presented. I think that our clients should be aware that with the hurricane reconstruction efforts in the South and in Texas, that it's likely that the shortage of labor and materials will drive construction costs higher in sort of that Texas to Florida geographic region. On the Texas deal, I thought the city fees they're pretty high at $112,000. A significant part of that is water and sewer, and the net result is $336 a foot, or 3.7. On the New England deal, that's a larger building on a larger piece of land. Notice the price per square foot is $659. There's a little bit more economies of scale there. However, notice the site work cost at $850,000, and that's because the site was unlevel, it was rocky, utilities had to be brought in. The building costs look low to me on a per square foot basis, but that's also driven by the fact that it's a larger building and you have some economies of scale in building a larger building. And so the Connecticut building is more expensive, $4.6 million, but on a price per foot basis and on a price per licensed capacity student basis, those ratios are favorable. Now, so full disclosure, John and I worked together on the deal in Minnesota, and some of the clients who are listening today, you and I worked on the projects in the other locations. I'm going to ask John to talk a little bit about the Minnesota project and to do his own compare and contrast analysis of how, as a developer and contractor, how he looks at these numbers and what lessons may be learned for the client audience.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing is as you look through, I would say the first thing before you even look at the numbers, I always tell people, don't get emotionally tied to real estate. Part of that is because as you start to look at sites, you have to really do that cost comparison. We look at a lot of them with our clients when we're developing them. We're looking at more retail sites than we are looking at some childcares. Well, they'll go 1-2 blocks off of the main drag. There's some rationale behind that. But that also changes some of the costs as well. But the big thing will be is because I think as Mike demonstrated is you can buy cheap land, but if it costs you more money to get it up to speed to be able to develop, or there's other things that are, some of those unknowns that you don't, like soil conditions, if it's expansive soils, those are going to cost you more on the construction side. So I think a lot of that really relates to your due diligence early on when you look at sites. And understanding what you are getting into when you're doing the sites, and again, working closely with a contractor early on to understand that. But I would say some of the variables too that you'll see between these is when you look at the cost of the construction. I mean, I can tell you, having worked in pretty much in all of these markets, not only doing what I'm doing today, but in my previous life, a lot of those factors that change the building costs are labor. You get into the New England area and you're dealing with a lot more unionized labor than you are in Minnesota. Going to California, your building costs, because you're having to deal with a lot more environmental accommodations that you need, either from stormwater storage, which is becoming a big deal nationally, to certain amount of site work that you're going to have to do related to landscape, that sometimes that gets lumped into building costs. But again, also where you're building it, because again, if you're in an area if you're in an industrial area, you don't have to make your building look as good. But if you're more in a retail area, using Mike's term gingerbread, you're going to have to put more gingerbread on the building. And the cities are going to require different types of material based on their zoning and ordinances. And so I think overall is that's where you're going to see the variables is you're going to see the labor, you're going to see, but it's where you're building it and the sites that you're really selecting. So I think that needs to be all taken into effect when you're evaluating sites.
John, in your experience, do the concrete block buildings, are those generally less expensive to build and than the wood frame buildings? And then the follow-up question is, how do you make a concrete block building look not like a concrete block building?
So the first question is part of it depends. Part of it depends on the marketplace. An example, I can go into Arizona and, CMU or concrete block buildings are going to be less expensive than wood, and you're going to have a longevity. Part of the reason people use that is because of termites, versus if I go into Minnesota, a lot of times the wood is a little less expensive. So it really varies. But for the most part, your concrete block buildings are less expensive because your labor to do it is a lot less intensive. It's easy to build, and from a speed and efficiency, it's easy to do. As far as, remind me what your other question was, Mark.
How do you make a concrete block building not look like a concrete block building?
Again, you can go into different types of concrete block, where you can go into split face, where it's it's got a different texture on one side of it. going into different color variations of the block where it's not just standard gray. I think the different use of how the block is laid, I mean, that creates some variety in the buildings. So I think there's a lot of different ways that you can do that, that really create that look and feel that it's not just a standard gray block building.
Okay. All right, very good. So let's move on. And as we get close to wrapping it up here, so here's some rules of the road. Be kind to time, as we've talked about before. These projects take a long time to get started. So if your lease is running out in 12 months and you haven't started, you might need to get a lease extension. If you're seeing that there's a new neighborhood opening up and you want to get open by January of the next year, you better be started 12 to 15 months ahead of that January timeframe. In many cases, the amount of time in pre-planning will be longer than the amount of time during construction. All right, let's be realistic on cost. Everybody wants it to cost as low as possible. Well, we don't want the clients to fool themselves and try to squeeze 10 pounds of stuff into a 5-pound bag. And so we always recommend to folks to use a healthy contingency factor at the beginning of the budget process and reduce the contingency as time goes on and more data points are known. In many cities now, it is common for a prospective builder or developer to go meet with the city before the actual plans are submitted for approval. We highly recommend that this informal meeting take place, and that way the city can give you any changes to municipal codes or any issues that may be arising in that neighborhood, and it's a chance to have an informal collaborative meeting with the folks at the city. John, would you describe your pre-submittal meetings with the cities that you do work in?
Yeah, I mean, one of the big things that we focus on is really giving them and telling them the story of what we're doing and why we're doing it. The big thing will be is if we're having a pre-submittal with the city, obviously to that point, if we're having a meeting, we've selected the site, we've understood all of the parameters behind it, and then we're really going in with a site plan to say, this is how we envision it being laid out. And part of that site planning work is going to be working with an engineer and an architect to make sure you're honoring the setback lines and what the parking requirements are based on your square footage. You can understand what the zoning ordinance is going to allow. And then at that point, you can talk to the city to really feel out for them as saying, okay, are you going to support this? Because if I have to go through, maybe it's a property that's zoned commercial or residential, and I'm going to rezone it to commercial. It's best to go in and have that pre-submittal meeting, because if you find out that they're not even going to support that being rezoned, or they're anticipating a lot of pushback from the neighbors as a part of that, that will be part of your decision-making process. Do I want to go down that avenue and spend the money? Because that, again, increases the risk. So those are some of the things that you're going to find out from the city. The other thing is you're going to find out is, even if you don't come in with a full design or some conceptual elevations, if you want to have some understanding or some design ideas of what you think these buildings are going to look like, even if you take images into them and show them to say, hey, here's a facility that I envision building there, they'll be able to give you some insight. It's one of those things, although they're the ones that are regulating it, they're also the ones that are your biggest cheerleaders and proponents on these projects, because they want to see it move forward just as much as anybody does, because again, new buildings on vacant land is increased tax base. And so that's really what they're going to look at. So they're really there to help and support it along the way, and can be really beneficial meeting with them early on to save you a lot of money.
Right, and a lot of money and raise red flags if there are any. Okay, right. So we're coming to the end. We've got one more slide to go, and hopefully we'll have chance for questions. So on the last slide, this is under the category of if stuff happens. And so what happens if my project gets delayed during construction? And The answer is it depends. Whose fault is it? Is it weather? Is it the contractor? Is it the owner? What happens if my builder needs more money to finish the construction? Well, hopefully we have adequately prepared the budget to make sure there is enough money. And finally, what happens if my building fails to get approval from licensing? That is a sticky wicket. And it's not usually going to be the developer or the contractor's fault that the building failed to get approval from licensing. So if we could have that next slide up so the audience can see these questions that we're talking about. And John, would you discuss your position on the failure to get the license?
As far as us, I think a lot of that, again, we don't, as a developer and as a builder, we don't have control of that. However, we're going to be there, and we always approach it. We're going to work with them to make sure that happens, because again, that's the success of the tenant. That's what we're focused on. But I think a lot of that is really working early on to vet that out. The key will be is making sure you're hiring an architect that understands childcare, because some of those factors will become of, how are things designed in the buildings and the materials on the outside. A lot of those, as it relates to playground area and security, those type of things, that becomes a key factor. But for us, as we always approach it, is the success of our tenant is the success for us. So however we can help work through that process, we're going to. And again, that ties back to having experience and hiring experienced people that understand the childcare environment.
And we advise the clients to involve the licensing authorities in the pre-planning stage. It's usually a requirement that drawings get submitted to a license agency ahead of time, and for your own peace of mind, it's advisable to do that. Once the building is built, if there are issues with the physical dimensions, it's very hard to change that once the building is built. The policies and procedures and the fire life safety exit plans and the kitchen menu items, those things are changeable. But once the building is built, and if you have to go back to the license agency and try to change the geometry, that's going to be a very challenging environment. We like to tell people understand the difference between cost and value, right? Just because it's cheap doesn't mean it's a good deal, especially in construction. We found that the low bid may not be the smart bid. Let's go down to the bottom here and briefly touch upon some of the types of construction contracts. There's a cost plus and there's a guaranteed max contract. John, would you please describe those two types of contracts?
Yeah, the first one I'll talk about is the guaranteed maximum price. So a lot of times what we like to go in is if the idea of the concept and the design hasn't been finished out, what we'll do is we can come in, provide what we call a guaranteed maximum price. What that does is we can do some preliminary estimates as the design is getting fine-tuned. So it's really what we'll say is it's a guaranteed maximum price. The price isn't going to go higher than this number unless we run into some unknowns. The nice part about that is for tenants going in is now we can say, all right, here's the guaranteed maximum price. Based on that, here's what your lease will be if we're the developer. And then our goal is for collectively is to get that price as low as we can, but really managing, the cost versus the value proposition, and really looking at that. And so really what we're doing is we're setting kind of, this price can't go any higher than this, which then equates to the lease or an ownership or a purchase price from, or an end construction number if somebody's going to own that. If they're going into the cost plus, that's basically saying, hey, here's what the cost of the material is going to be, here's the cost of the services, and then you're just playing a markup on that. What that allows now owners to do is they can now be very collaborative and saying, I want granite versus corian on my countertops. Well, now they understand is saying, hey, that cost is going to change, but maybe the fee related to that isn't. So now they're a little bit more in control of the materials and the cost of the building. So it really gives them a little bit more collaborative, and they have a little bit more control of but also making those cost decisions if the price is going to go up and down in the building.
So under the cost plus, the developer or contractor is fairly neutral. He doesn't care if the owner wants to change his mind because he's getting a certain markup. Under the
Correct.
Under the GMAX, the contractor is going to have a pretty tight control over the specifications because he's promised the operator, the tenant, a maximum price, and the not more and not less than the specifications will be delivered.
That's correct.
Right. One issue that has come up recently with insurance is that many of the professionals, the architects and engineers, will insist on a liability cap for mistakes they make. And we want to caution the audience to consult with their lawyer. But if you hire an architect to build your $3 million building and you're paying him a $50,000 fee and he makes a mistake and you signed a contract with him that says that the liability cap is equal to the $50,000 you paid him, but it costs $1 million to fix it, well, who's gonna pay for that? So we urge you to read your contracts and hire a lawyer. As Shakespeare said, everybody hates lawyers except the one that represents them. All right, so now we want to thank everybody for participating. We have time for a couple of questions. I know we're running just a few minutes over, but there was a lot of information to cover. And so if, for those of you that have questions, please type them in the box. We're certainly available to answer questions after the webinar is over if you have case-by-case questions. And we would love to introduce Jon to any of those of you in the Minnesota area or the upper Midwest, or frankly, they have the ability to travel. So if you have specific questions, we would love to be able to help you out. Here comes a question. Jon, which comes first, the site, the developer, or the architect?
It's the notorious question. It depends. I think a lot of times from an operator standpoint is if they understand a marketplace in an area, in a region that they want to go into and have some ideas on sites, I think at that point, often the site is the first one that comes. And then it's really starting to identify as to what avenue do I approach. But also, too, is understanding, if I'm going out and selecting a site, but I don't have the money to do it, then I really need that developer in tow as well, because you don't want to get so far down an avenue, and then all of a sudden, the math doesn't make sense, or you can't find anybody to finance it. Now all of a sudden you're moving to a different site. So it's really kind of the balance of the two. But typically, site marketplaces are the first one you're going to look at.
Okay. And if you find a site, there may be occasions where that site is already controlled by a developer and he or she wants to do the build-to-suit for you.
Correct.
Right. Okay. How do I calculate the rent that I would owe if a developer is going to build it for me? Well, the answer to that is that the total cost of the project will be calculated early on in the negotiation process. There'll be an estimate made, and that estimate will be refined as time goes on. And in order for the developer to get repaid, he's going to utilize a ratio called a return on cost number. And that number is expressed as a percentage usually. So if the project cost is $3 million, and you've asked the developer to price that out to calculate the rent, the developer will take the total project cost, multiply it by the return on cost to come up with the first year rent. And that ratio ranges depending on geography, depending on the length of lease, depending on the credit quality of the tenant. Some of our big national companies with hundreds of locations, they can push that return on cost number lower, mid 8% range. if this is your very first building in a challenging geographic market, and a lot of the other circumstances perhaps are difficult, that return on cost number might be in the 10 to 11 range. John, as a developer, what is your experience with that?
I think the ranges you talked, I think, are pretty known. I mean, again, I always tell people and suggest to them to say, hey, when you're looking at sites, it may look like that site is more expensive, and I can get a cheaper one off the block, but yet by going 2-3 blocks off the main drag as a developer, I'm taking on more risk of, okay, how am I going to reposition that building if that child care goes away 15, 20, 30 years down the road? What can that be repositioned for? So again, if it's on a higher profile, that gives me, it's more likely I'm going to pay a little bit more for the dirt, but yet I know that that property is going to be worth something long term. It's the idea behind real estate. It's about location. So the better the position, that really starts to balance it out and really make up for other things that may cost you another avenue.
So for the audience out there, a quick rule of thumb might be to take your total project cost and multiply it by 9%. So if you're at $3 million on a total project cost, multiply it by 9%. That's $270,000. That would be your annual rent. Now, if you have superior credit quality, you found an outstanding location, and you're going to pitch in a little bit of money, let's say, for the playground, and you're not trying to push all the risk onto the developer, you probably get a little better ratio. If this is your first project, you don't necessarily have 20 other schools in your portfolio, you're trying to push all the risk on the developer, the location is secondary, you might be looking at a 10% return on cost or higher to justify the risk to that developer.
And one thing I would add in there too is when you look at that is for those groups is don't necessarily just look at the rent, because it's also going to depend on your lease. Are you going to be responsible for maintaining that building? Because you may be paying $200,000 in rent, but if it's a building that maybe wasn't built as good or using lesser materials, and you're committed to maintain that building, energy, whatever it may be, replacement of HVAC if it goes out after the warranty period, those are things that really need to be taken into consideration as well. Are you maintaining the landscape, or is the owner maintaining the landscape? Those are factors that are ultimately going to net out to what is that ultimate rent you're going to pay for that year.
Right. Okay, so as we wrap up here, I would like to thank our guest, Jon Fahning, and remind the audience of one of the comments that he made, that this is a holistic process. While there are many deal points, really the sum is bigger than the parts. It's a holistic process. I did get a couple questions here that ask for specific cost data in their specific market, and we'll be in contact with those particular folks. The cost data that we provided was a broad brush of different geographic areas. Unfortunately, we do not have cost data for every single location, but we will be in touch with those folks to give them feedback. John, any parting words?
No, thanks for the opportunity. And again, if there's anything I can help and answer any questions, I'm here to provide that.
Very good. Thank you very much. And thanks to all for listening. And we want to be your child care resource for all issues regarding the business of education. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Take care.